The cameras were already rolling when Kash Patel leaned back in his chair, smirking with the ease of a man who thought the stage belonged to him. His words dripped with condescension, every syllable sharpened into a blade meant to cut down not just Jasmine Crockett, but everything she represented. With a casual flick of his wrist, he dismissed her point entirely, sneering as he said she was out of her depth and should stick to the basics before trying to play in the big leagues. The insult hung in the air like smoke. The studio audience shifted uneasily, a mix of nervous laughter and muffled gasps rippling across the room. The moderators tried to keep their composure, eyes darting between the two figures as though they knew a storm was brewing. The cameras zoomed in on Patel, his grin stretching wider, feeding off the tension. He thought he'd won. He thought he'd humiliated her. But then, silence. The camera cut to Jasmine Crockett. She didn't flinch. She didn't bite back right away. She sat perfectly still, shoulders squared, eyes locked on Patel with a focus that cut through the smugness on his face, the kind of silence that feels louder than a scream. The crowd leaned forward. You could hear the soft hum of the studio lights, the shuffling of papers from a producer off camera, and nothing else. Would she take it? Would she let it slide, the way so many before her had, turning the other cheek just to keep the peace? Or would she fight back, risking everything on national television? Patel's smirk began to falter. For the first time, he looked uneasy. Jasmine's gaze didn't waver, and the silence she held carried the weight of 1,000 unsaid truths, the stories of those who had been told to know their place, to stay quiet, to be grateful. The tension wrapped around the room like a tightening rope. The audience's breath slowed, waiting for the break, waiting for the fire. And then Jasmine leaned ever so slightly toward the microphone, lips parting, eyes blazing with quiet resolve. What came next wasn't just a response. It was a career-defining moment that stunned everyone watching. This was never just a debate. It was never just another sparring match under the bright lights of a studio stage. What unfolded in that room carried the weight of something larger, something America has wrestled with for generations. Who gets to speak? Who gets to define the narrative, and whose voice is treated with dignity? Kash Patel wasn't simply another talking head offering political commentary. To many watching, he embodied an old, tired arrogance, the kind that dismisses others before they even finish their thought. His tone, his smirk, his calculated dismissal of Jasmine Crockett wasn't random. It was a performance rooted in a mindset that has thrived on belittling those who dare to challenge power, especially when that challenger happens to be a woman of color who refuses to shrink herself for anyone's comfort. On the surface, it seemed like another sharp exchange in a long line of TV clashes. But for those paying attention, it was more. Patel represented every boss who cut down an employee with brilliance but not pedigree. He carried the same posture of every official who looked past communities crying out for justice, brushing them aside with a wave of the hand. To his supporters, he was clever. To those who saw through him, he was a reminder of how power often cloaks insecurity with arrogance. And then there was Jasmine. Sitting across from him, every bit of her composure signaled something Patel couldn't fake: resilience. She didn't need to pound the table or raise her voice. Her power wasn't in theatrics. It was in the calm assurance that comes from truth. She represented the millions who have been told, "You don't belong here," but stayed anyway. She carried the dignity of those who fought to carve space in rooms that were never designed for them. To many in the audience, she wasn't just another politician. She was proof that persistence can break barriers, that courage can stand tall even under the brightest, most unforgiving lights. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't about a single soundbite. It was about who America chooses to uplift, who we see as credible, and whose story we allow to be silenced. Every viewer at home was, in a sense, casting a vote, not with a ballot, but with their hearts. Would they side with arrogance dressed up as authority, or with dignity rooted in lived truth? The tension in that studio told its own story. The audience shifted in their seats, sensing the gravity of what was about to unfold. It was more than politics. It was a cultural reckoning, condensed into a single exchange, a single camera frame, a single pause before the storm. And the beauty of it? The people in that room had no idea they were about to witness history. They didn't know the clip would be replayed millions of times across phones, laptops, and television screens. They didn't yet grasp that this moment would ignite conversations in living rooms, inspire hashtags, and become the spark for a national debate far bigger than Patel's sneer or Crockett's poise. All they knew was the silence, the stillness, and the mounting pressure. The audience didn't know it yet. But they were about to witness a moment that would go viral across the country. To understand why this clash mattered, you have to know who Kash Patel is and what he represents. His rise through the ranks wasn't the story of quiet dedication or selfless service. No, Patel's career has always been marked by sharp elbows, political maneuvering, and a belief that loyalty to power matters more than loyalty to truth. He first emerged in the political scene not as a voice of the people, but as a loyal operative, carving out a reputation for doing whatever it took to protect those above him. To his allies, that made him useful. To his critics, it made him dangerous. He wasn't the kind of man who built bridges. He was the kind of man who burned them, smiling as the smoke rose behind him. Again and again, Patel found himself at the center of controversy. During his time in government, reports surfaced of him twisting intelligence assessments, downplaying threats, and pushing narratives that conveniently aligned with the political agendas of his patrons. To him, bending the truth wasn't a weakness, it was strategy. He wore it like armor, convinced that if he could talk loudly enough, confidently enough, people would stop questioning whether what he said was real. But here's the contradiction that always trailed him. For all his arrogance, Patel never seemed to realize how transparent it was. He styled himself as untouchable, yet each appearance exposed just how deeply he relied on bluster to cover insecurities. The smirk, the dismissive tone, the cutting one-liners, they weren't signs of strength. They were signals of a man terrified of losing control in a conversation he couldn't dominate. He had a pattern. Every debate, every interview, every appearance followed the same script. He would arrive with the swagger of certainty, use dismissiveness to rattle his opponent, then seize the spotlight with a line designed to humiliate. To him, it wasn't about ideas, it was about dominance. He thrived on making others shrink under the weight of his condescension. And it had worked for years. His critics would fumble, tripping over words while he sailed past them with smirks and interruptions. He built his brand on these encounters, each one reinforcing his belief that he was invincible in the arena of public sparring. Every time he walked into a debate, he carried the confidence of someone who believed the ending was already written. But arrogance blinds. And in Patel's case, it left him underestimating opponents again and again. He underestimated journalists who pressed him with facts, dismissing them as biased. He underestimated career officials who raised alarms, brushing them off as irrelevant. And on this particular night, under the bright studio lights, he underestimated Jasmine Crockett. To him, she was just another obstacle to swat aside, another politician he could reduce to silence with a calculated jab. He believed the outcome was inevitable because, for so long, it had been. Yet this time, he had walked into something different. This wasn't just another exchange he could dominate with arrogance and bravado. Across from him sat someone who had faced down far greater challenges than his smirk or his sneer. Someone who wasn't intimidated by the volume of his voice or the sharpness of his words. But Patel didn't see it. Not yet. He leaned back in his chair with the same confidence he always carried, convinced that this debate would play out like all the others. He thought this was just another debate he could dominate. He had no idea what was coming. To understand why Jasmine Crockett mattered in this moment, you have to understand where she came from. Hers is not the story of privilege or shortcuts. It is the story of grit, of choosing the harder road and of carrying not just her own name, but the hopes of people who have long been overlooked. Born into modest beginnings, Jasmine was no stranger to struggle. She grew up seeing the disparities that defined America, how certain neighborhoods had opportunity written into their streets, while others fought for every ounce of dignity. Those early years shaped her, not with bitterness, but with a deep hunger for justice. While others dreamed of escape, she dreamed of change, of standing in the very rooms where decisions were made and making sure those who'd been silenced finally had a voice. Law became her path. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. She chose to fight in courtrooms where the odds were stacked against ordinary people. For years, she defended clients who didn't have lobbyists or wealth, only the truth of their stories and a hope that someone would believe them. Every case she took on wasn't just legal work. It was a statement, a declaration that fairness should not be a privilege. And while she often walked into those courtrooms outnumbered, she walked out with respect, the kind that can't be bought, only earned. But Crockett's journey didn't stop at the courthouse doors. The more she fought for justice in the courtroom, the more she saw the root of the problem. Laws written by people who never knew the weight of poverty, policies designed by those who never had to live with their consequences. That realization pushed her into politics, not as a career move, but as a continuation of her mission. She ran, she fought, and she won. Not because she had the biggest donors, but because she had authenticity, resilience, and a refusal to bow down. Her rise wasn't meteoric. It was hard fought. Every step forward came with resistance, whispers that she was too loud, too unapologetic, too unwilling to play the game. But Jasmine never entered politics to play. She entered to speak, to represent, to prove that people who looked like her, who carried her background, weren't tokens or afterthoughts. They were leaders. And that is why she resonates. For millions of Americans who've been told to sit down, to wait their turn, to keep their voices low, Jasmine stands as proof that you don't have to apologize for your presence. She brings into those chambers the voices of the working class, immigrants, women of color, and anyone who has ever been underestimated. She wears her identity like armor, not something to conceal, but something to wield. It's also what made her the only person capable of delivering the takedown Patel never saw coming. Because Crockett knew what it felt like to be dismissed, to be underestimated, to be told she wasn't enough. And each of those moments had forged in her a resilience Patel couldn't even recognize. Where he mistook silence for weakness, she understood silence as power, the calm before the storm. In the lead-up to that debate, supporters knew Patel would try to belittle her. That was his trademark. But they also knew something else. Crockett wasn't walking into that room alone. She carried with her the voices of every courtroom client, every voter who believed in her, every American who had been told their truth didn't matter. And in that moment, she was their vessel, their champion. So when Patel leaned in with that condescending smirk, tossing out his jab designed to rattle her, the audience held its breath. For a flicker of a second, the studio was still. Would she let it slide? Would she take the bait? Would she, like so many before her, stumble under the weight of his arrogance? No. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Not for a second. She met his eyes with unshaken resolve. And in that silence, before a single word left her mouth, something shifted. The audience felt it. Patel didn't, not yet. But the balance of power in that room had already begun to tilt, because Crockett wasn't just about to respond. She was about to remind everyone why she mattered, why her voice mattered, and why Patel's arrogance had finally found its match. And when Patel tried to dismiss her, she didn't flinch. Instead, she loaded the comeback that would define the night. The debate stage felt less like a forum for ideas and more like an arena. The lights burned hot, the cameras were fixed, and the audience leaned forward, caught in the invisible tug-of-war between arrogance and resolve. Kash Patel, confident as ever, carried himself with the smug ease of a man who believed the show belonged to him, and for a time it almost seemed like he was right. He started with interruptions, subtle at first, a clipped chuckle while Jasmine spoke, a muttered, "That's not true," under his breath. But quickly, the dismissals grew bolder. He talked over her, cutting through her sentences with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. His tone wasn't just disagreement, it was dismissal. As if her words weren't worthy of full attention, as if her presence was merely an inconvenience he had to swat away. "Listen," Patel said with that condescending grin, "I've worked at the highest levels of government. I know how this works. Maybe if you had the same experience, you'd understand." His words dripped with arrogance, punctuated by the knowing glance he cast at the crowd, inviting them to share in his superiority. The audience shifted. Some laughed nervously, others groaned. A woman in the second row muttered, "Unbelievable." A man shook his head. The tension was mounting, building with each smug interruption. But Jasmine? She didn't flinch. Her silence was not surrender, it was strategy. She let him run his mouth, let him grow comfortable in the sound of his own voice. Each time he spoke over her, she simply stopped, looked at him and waited. The cameras caught it, the unblinking stare, the patience that felt like a storm building on the horizon. And while Patel mistook her composure for weakness, the audience began to sense something else. Restraint. Power waiting to be unleashed. Patel pressed harder, growing reckless in his need to dominate. He dismissed her points outright, shaking his head with a patronizing smile. "That's cute," he said at one point, "but this is serious policy work. Leave the sound bites to social media." Gasps echoed through the audience. The arrogance was no longer subtle, it was on full display. Still, Jasmine didn't bite. She let the insult hang in the air unchallenged for now. The viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. The live audience whispered among themselves, sensing that the balance was fragile, that something was about to give. Patel, blinded by his own bravado, pushed further. "See, this is exactly the problem," he said, his voice rising with misplaced confidence. "We've got people here who think passion substitutes for knowledge, who think being loud makes you right. But the truth is, some of us have earned our place. Others," he let the pause linger, then finished with a smirk. "Others are just filling a seat." The audience erupted in gasps and murmurs. A few shook their heads in disbelief, others groaned audibly. But Patel mistook their reaction for support, leaning back in his chair as if he had delivered the final word. And still Jasmine stayed composed. She adjusted her microphone, her eyes locked on Patel. No anger, no visible frustration, just steady, deliberate calm. She wasn't rising to his bait. She was preparing to strike when the moment was right. The energy in the room shifted again. The tension was no longer about Patel's dominance. It was about the anticipation of what Jasmine would do next. Viewers felt it. The audience in the studio felt it. The silence that followed Patel's last jab wasn't emptiness, it was a drumbeat of suspense. For the first time, Patel noticed the weight of her gaze. He stumbled slightly, filling the silence with more words, more noise, as if afraid of what might come if she spoke. "I mean, honestly, it's laughable," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "You don't even understand the basics, and here you are lecturing me on policy? Please." And that was it, the arrogance cresting at its peak. The audience couldn't take their eyes off Jasmine now. Their breaths caught, waiting, watching, hoping. Everyone thought Patel had the upper hand, until Crockett leaned into her microphone. The air in the room tightened. Patel had just dismissed her with a smirk, the kind of smirk that said he believed he had sealed the debate. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded, satisfied with himself. The cameras hovered between them, lingering on his grin, then cutting back to Jasmine's steady gaze. She leaned into her microphone, slow and deliberate. The audience, restless just moments earlier, froze. The tension became unbearable. You could hear a cough echo from the back row, the shuffle of papers from a producer off stage. Jasmine inhaled, exhaled, and began. "You know, Mr. Patel." Her voice was calm, steady, but razor-sharp. "You keep bragging about your so-called experience, about how you've earned your place. But let's tell the truth tonight, shall we? Because experience without integrity doesn't make you qualified. It just makes you practiced at playing the game." The audience stirred, some letting out quiet mms. Patel shifted in his chair, his grin stiffening. Jasmine continued, her tone unwavering. "You talk about seats being filled as if the only people who deserve to sit here are the ones who look like you, talk like you, serve the same old interests you've always served. But let me remind you, this seat wasn't handed to me. I didn't come here on the coattails of some powerful patron. I fought for it. I earned it the hard way. Not by dismissing voices, but by amplifying them." The crowd broke into applause. Patel tried to interject, leaning toward his mic, but Jasmine lifted a hand, not to silence him, but to command the room. The applause rolled through like thunder, then faded as quickly as it came, leaving her words hanging in the air. She leaned closer. "You see, I know what it's like to be told you don't belong. I've heard it my entire life. Too young, too black, too outspoken. Too unwilling to bow down to men who think they own the stage. But every time I heard you don't belong, I proved that I did. And not for myself." She paused, locking eyes with the audience. "But for every person watching who has ever been told to sit down, shut up and wait their turn." A hush fell. The studio lights seemed brighter, the cameras tighter. Patel opened his mouth, but no words came out. His smirk was gone, replaced by a strained expression, and caught between indignation and panic. Jasmine pressed on, sharper now, her voice rising with conviction. You want to talk about policy? Fine. But don't confuse arrogance for expertise. Don't mistake condescension for knowledge. Because let's be honest, Mr. Patel, you've made a career out of serving power, not people. You stand here tonight, pretending to lecture me, pretending to lecture this audience, as though you're the authority on who deserves to lead. But what you're really afraid of is that your time is up, that people like me, people who don't fit your mold, who aren't afraid of your smirks or your dismissals, are changing the conversation, and you can't control it anymore. The audience exploded. Cheers, applause, whistles. A standing ovation rippled through the first few rows. Patel tried again to speak, his voice faltering over the noise. That's... But the audience drowned him out. His confidence cracked under the weight of their reaction. And Jasmine wasn't done. She waited, letting the applause crest and fall, then struck the final blow. So here's the truth. You can talk over me all you want. You can roll your eyes, you can smirk, you can dismiss me. But you can't erase me. I am here. I am staying. And every single time someone like you tries to push me down, I will rise louder, stronger and prouder, because this is not just my seat. This is our seat, and no amount of arrogance will ever take that away. Silence. For one heartbeat, maybe two, the room was utterly still. The audience froze, caught in the gravity of the words. Patel sat stiff, mouth open, searching desperately for a comeback that wouldn't come. His face reddened, his composure slipping. And then, eruption. The studio shook with applause, louder than before, this time sustained. The sound was overwhelming, laughter spilling in between cheers as people shook their heads in disbelief. Some clapped with tears in their eyes. Others shouted, "Yes!" over the roar. Patel tried to laugh it off, forcing a smirk, but it came out brittle. He stammered, leaning toward the mic. That's just rhetoric. That's not substance. That's... His words tangled. The more he tried to regain control, the weaker he looked. The swagger was gone, replaced by frantic deflection. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, not saying another word. She didn't need to. The point was made. She had turned his arrogance into her platform, his insults into her fire. The cameras zoomed in on Patel's face, flushed, rattled, struggling. Then they cut to Jasmine, composed, calm, almost serene, as if she had been waiting for this very moment all along. The audience clapped again, longer this time, refusing to let the energy die. It wasn't just applause, it was release. Release of frustration at years of arrogance, years of being talked over, years of watching voices like Patel's dominate. Jasmine had cracked it open and the people felt it. Patel tried one last time, muttering into the mic about experience, about qualifications, but his voice was shaky, drowned out by laughter that spread across the room. His authority had been punctured, his control had collapsed. He looked less like the master of the stage and more like a man who had been cornered, exposed. And Jasmine? She didn't need to gloat. She didn't need to drive the point further. She let the silence between applause do the work. She let Patel's unraveling become the exclamation point to her words. At first, the room was silent, and then it transformed. What began as applause had turned into a wave, a force that carried beyond the studio walls. The cameras captured every moment, beaming it out into living rooms, onto phones, into headlines that were already writing themselves. The audience in that studio would remember it forever, the moment Patel's arrogance met its match. But what they didn't know, not yet, was that the shockwaves didn't end in that studio. They were just beginning. The studio was still buzzing when the cameras cut to commercial. Commentators who had been sitting in stiff neutrality suddenly leaned in with widened eyes and barely disguised grins. One of them whispered into a hot mic, "She just ended him," before catching themselves while another fumbled through hurried notes, already planning how to spin the spectacle in real time. In the audience, people were still on their feet, talking over one another, replaying the lines that had just detonated across the stage. When the broadcast returned, the anchors tried to resume composure, but their voices carried the unmistakable tremor of excitement. "Well, that was certainly an exchange," one host said, the understatement earning a ripple of laughter from the crowd. Another shook her head and added, "I think we just witnessed a turning point tonight." Their words carried weight because the audience knew this wasn't politics as usual. Something irreversible had just happened. Even as the broadcast continued, the true eruption was happening elsewhere. Phones lit up in living rooms across the country. Clips of Jasmine's takedown were cut, looped, captioned, and blasted onto Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram before the studio lights had cooled. By the time the show ended, her words, "This is our seat," were already trending, stitched onto videos, written into bold text on viral graphics, chanted over remixed beats that turned a debate into an anthem. The hashtags came fast and fierce. Crockett clapback, our seat, mic drop moment. Each one spread like wildfire, gaining traction as millions of users jumped into the frenzy. Memes sprang up instantly. Patel's bewildered expression frozen into the backdrop of captions like, "When you realize the arrogance ran out, and she ate and left no crumbs." GIFs of Jasmine's poised silence after her final blow were shared as the universal reaction to every online argument. Journalists raced to publish think pieces within the hour. Headlines screamed across screens. Crockett redefines the debate stage. Patel outclassed in stunning showdown. The night the tables turned. Progressive outlets celebrated her as a rising star, while even some conservative commentators grudgingly admitted Patel had been visibly rattled. It wasn't just that Jasmine had landed a punch, it was that she had shifted the balance of power in front of millions. Public figures weighed in quickly. Activists praised her courage, celebrities tweeted out her one-liners, and even a few lawmakers who had been quietly critical of Patel couldn't resist posting cryptic reactions. A well-known civil rights leader wrote, "What Crockett did tonight wasn't just about one debate. It was about reclaiming dignity for every voice that's been told to wait its turn." The tweet amassed hundreds of thousands of likes within hours. Meanwhile, Patel scrambled to control the narrative. His team issued a statement downplaying the moment, insisting he had been focused on policy, not performance. But the attempt fell flat. Everywhere he went online, his name was paired with Jasmine's, and always as the loser of the exchange. The story wasn't Patel's arguments. It was Patel gets silenced, Patel humiliated, Patel outmatched. Late-night hosts joined the pile-on, replaying the clip to roaring laughter. One joked, "I haven't seen a takedown that brutal since my Wi-Fi bill last month." Another quipped, Patel thought he was the professor, but Crockett reminded him class was in session. Each punchline deepened the cultural imprint. But the moment wasn't confined to comedy or social media. In barbershops, coffee houses, college dorms, and kitchen tables, people were talking. Parents pointed out Jasmine's words to their kids. Teachers brought up the debate in classrooms as an example of poise under pressure. For many, it wasn't about politics at all. It was about finally seeing someone unapologetically defend identity, pride, and belonging on a stage where those things were too often trampled. And Patel? His embarrassment wasn't just a fleeting meme. It became the national conversation, a symbol of arrogance crumbling under authenticity. Every attempt to reclaim footing only reminded people of how completely he had lost it in that moment. But beyond the trending hashtags, there was something much deeper at play. In the days that followed, it became clear that Jasmine Crockett's comeback had outgrown the walls of the studio. What many thought was a fleeting exchange had transformed into something much bigger, a story retold, reshared, and relived by people who saw in her words a reflection of their own struggles. What she did in that moment was more than expose Patel's arrogance. She reframed the entire conversation around what truly holds power in America: dignity. Because Patel hadn't just underestimated Jasmine, he had underestimated everyone who ever sat quietly, listening to insults disguised as debate. He believed dominance was in volume, in interruption, in entitlement. But Jasmine revealed the deeper truth. Strength is not found in how loudly you speak, but in how unshakably you stand. Her clapback wasn't just witty, it was symbolic. For those who had been dismissed because of their gender, their skin, their accent, or their roots, she spoke directly to them without needing to name them. When she said, "This is our seat," she wasn't just defending herself, she was defending the millions who had been told they didn't belong. The victory wasn't hers alone, it was shared by everyone who had ever felt invisible in spaces designed to silence them. Commentators began to recognize it too. One analyst put it plainly: what Crockett showed us wasn't politics. It was humanity. It was dignity, standing up to arrogance and proving which one endures. That line struck a chord because it captured what so many had already felt in their gut. Patel's bluster faded in seconds, but Crockett's composure echoed long after. As her words spread, they began to morph into something more profound. They weren't just a mic drop, they were a mantra. Protest signs appeared at rallies with her line emblazoned across them. College students repeated her words when challenging authority in their own classrooms. Workers in break rooms brought up her response as proof that no insult is too sharp when dignity shields you. The comeback became less about politics and more about principle. And perhaps that is why it resonated so deeply. Because dignity, unlike arrogance, cannot be faked. Arrogance demands recognition. Dignity commands it. Arrogance feeds on belittling others. Dignity lifts them higher. Arrogance burns hot and fast. Dignity endures quietly, like coals that keep the fire alive. Jasmine embodied this truth, and in doing so, she revealed the emptiness of Patel's performance. For all his experience, for all his bluster, Patel failed to understand that the stage doesn't belong to the loudest, it belongs to the most grounded. And when he tried to bury her under arrogance, she reminded him, and everyone watching, that you cannot bury what continues to rise. Her symbolic victory wasn't measured in polls or headlines alone. It was measured in the silence that followed her words, in the laughter that erupted at Patel's unraveling, in the standing ovations that broke out across living rooms nationwide. The lesson was clear. Arrogance can dominate a moment, but dignity defines an era. By the week's end, even critics who once dismissed her as untested began to admit something had shifted. She had shown that the most powerful rebuttal isn't anger, nor is it insult. It is the calm assurance that truth does not need to shout, and that truth carried a universal weight. Because this wasn't only about Patel versus Crockett. It was about every boardroom where arrogance sneers at quiet resilience, every classroom where a hand raised in dignity gets laughed at, every home where someone wonders if they belong. Jasmine gave those people an answer, not in theory but in action. The moral was undeniable. Dignity is not weakness. Dignity is power, and when it rises, arrogance has nowhere to hide. Because when dignity rises, no insult can bury it. What began as a clash of words on a studio stage quickly transformed into something unforgettable, a savage comeback that didn't just silence arrogance but shook an entire nation awake. Jasmine Crockett's response wasn't a momentary win. It was a reminder that truth, spoken with dignity, will always tower over those who thrive on noise and dismissal. Think about what we witnessed. Patel tried to dominate the conversation with condescension, interruptions, and arrogance. But Crockett didn't just answer him. She redefined the battlefield. She showed us that when you meet insult with composure and arrogance with truth, the outcome is never in doubt. That's why this wasn't just a soundbite. It was a shift in the narrative of who gets to hold the mic and whose voices echo long after the cameras stop rolling. And here's where you come in. If you felt the power of that moment, if you saw yourself in her calm defiance, then don't let it end here. Share this story. Subscribe so these voices that challenge arrogance with dignity, continue to be amplified. Because every time we elevate truth, we push back against the noise designed to drown it out. This was more than just a debate. It was a reminder of what's possible when courage meets clarity, when dignity meets disrespect, and when truth refuses to back down. Because moments like this don't just fade, they ripple, and together we make sure those ripples become waves. This wasn't just a debate, it was history in the making.